Hi, friends. Last Sunday, we considered the account of Saul's encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road and his subsequent interactions with Jesus' followers in that city. It's in the 9th chapter of the book of Acts. We focused on the grace that the Damascene, that's the adjective form of Damascus, the grace that the Damascene disciple showed to Saul by helping him escape being arrested and killed by those who wanted to silence his preaching that Jesus is the Messiah. They lowered him in a basket through a window in the city wall in the middle of the night to safety, saving his life and his mission. Today, I want to share a couple of tidbits that didn't make it into Sunday's sermon. The first is the basket in which Saul escaped. Now, obviously, for a full-grown man to fit into a basket, it had to be a pretty large one. The point of interest is that the word for basket used for Saul's escape is the same word that the gospel writer Mark uses to designate the baskets of food that were left over after Jesus fed 4,000. In Mark 8, we read, Jesus told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, and gave them to the disciples to distribute. And they gave the bread to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said a blessing over them and gave them to the disciples to hand out also. They ate until they were full. They collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. And this was a crowd of about 4,000 people. Not only is it miraculous that Jesus fed that many people with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish, but also that from that meager fare, there were 7 baskets that were big enough for a full-grown man, full of leftovers. God's provision is abundant, and there is more than enough for everyone. We just have to remember to share generously and not to fear scarcity. Another interesting observation is that although being lowered down a city wall in the middle of the night is an unusual experience, it's not the first time that it happens in the biblical witness. When the Israelites were entering the Promised Land, their leader, Joshua, sent spies into the city of Jericho on a reconnaissance mission. Their cover was blown, and the king wanted to take them into custody. But a woman named Rahab hid the spies and sent the king's guards on a wild goose chase. Later that night, she lowered the spies to safety on a rope through a window that her house shared with the city wall. Again, in the book of 1 Samuel, we read about David, before he became king, under the threat of death by King Saul, not to be confused with the Apostle Saul in the book of Acts. King Saul put guards around David's house so that they could kill him when he left in the morning. David's wife, Michal, lowered him through a window to safety so that he could escape. Now, we don't usually think of these escapes as pivotal moments in the biblical story, but really they are. If the Israelite spies had been captured and killed, Joshua wouldn't have had the information that he needed for a successful attack on Jericho and the subsequent conquest of the Promised Land. If Israel had been unsuccessful in occupying the Promised Land, then they wouldn't have become a nation, or at least not a very strong one. If Israel hadn't become a nation, they would never have needed a king or developed a dynasty. And if David had been killed by King Saul's messengers, he would never have become king of Israel or established the monarchy from which the Messiah would come. If the Apostle Saul had been killed, he would not have spread the good news that Jesus is that Messiah to both Jews and Gentiles alike. And if Gentiles hadn't been included in that message, we would not be here doing this today. God's provision is abundant in more ways than one. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.